On the second-floor gallery of a church in Constantinople, someone got bored enough to pull a knife and carve his name into the stone railing. The letters aren't Greek, they're runes. And the man who scratched them was paid to stand beside the Roman emperor, close enough to kill him, and trusted for exactly one reason: he never would. We'll come back to that railing. It's still there. For most of Roman history, the greatest danger to an emperor wasn't a barbarian army or a rival across some distant border. It was the armed men standing closest to him. The Praetorian Guard, the elite unit created to protect the emperor, spent the better part of 3 centuries auditioning for the role of his executioner. They killed Caligula. They famously auctioned off the throne in 193, selling the entire empire to the highest bidder like a used cart, to a man who then discovered the sellers didn't actually own what they'd sold. Over and over, the people paid to keep the emperor alive decided they'd rather choose the next one. And here's the part that matters, because it isn't bad luck, it's design. The Praetorians were Romans. They lived in Rome. They had families in the city, patrons in the Senate, cousins with ambitions, and a very real stake in who wore the purple next. A guard with a future in the game will, sooner or later, start playing it. Loyalty was competing with opportunity, and opportunity usually wins. That's the problem the Eastern emperors inherited when the West fell away and Constantinople became the beating heart of what was still, defiantly, called the Roman Empire. Same throne, same knives. The question was never how do we find brave men. Brave men were everywhere. The question was how do you find men who will guard power without wanting it for themselves? The answer the Byzantines arrived at is one of the coldest, most elegant pieces of political engineering in the medieval world, and it works by inverting every instinct you'd expect. If the danger is a guard with something to gain, then you don't go looking for a more honest Roman. You go looking for someone who can gain nothing at all. Bring in a warrior from the far north, from the rivers of the Rus, from Scandinavia, later from a conquered England. Drop him into Constantinople and ask what he actually has. No seat in the Senate, because the Senate would never have him. No local clan to raise a rebellion on his behalf. No claim to the throne, because a foreigner who could barely manage the Greek was never going to be crowned Roman emperor, and everyone, including him, knew it. His entire world, his pay, his status, his plunder, his very safety in a city that saw him as an exotic curiosity flowed from a single source: the living emperor. That's the whole trick. His loyalty wasn't a virtue you had to trust. It was a consequence you could calculate. Betray the emperor, and what exactly do you inherit? Nothing. There's no faction waiting to reward you, no throne you could ever sit on. The man with no path upward has no reason to climb over the body in front of him. The Byzantines didn't buy loyalty. They removed every alternative to it. The moment this stopped being a clever idea and became an institution can be dated with unusual precision. In 988, the Emperor Basil II was in the kind of trouble that ends dynasties. 2 of his most powerful generals had risen in revolt. His own armies were unreliable, and the throne he'd inherited was genuinely slipping out from under him. So he called in a debt. Years earlier, a treaty had bound the ruler of Kievan Rus to send military aid, and Basil now cashed it in. 6,000 warriors came south, axe-carrying Northmen, shipped down the rivers to a Roman emperor who needed men whose weapons pointed only outward. The price tells you everything about how badly Basil needed them and how neatly the deal suited both sides. In exchange, the Kievan prince Vladimir received the emperor's own sister, Anna, in marriage. A Byzantine princess was almost never handed to a foreigner, and Vladimir agreed to bring himself and his people into the Christian faith. An entire nation's religion and a dynasty's survival settled in the same contract. The 6,000 did their job, and they did it fast. In a night crossing of the water outside the capital, they fell on one rebel force before it knew they'd arrived and broke it in the dark. The following year, the revolt collapsed for good when its leader, one of those overmighty generals, suddenly dropped dead on the field in front of both armies. The chroniclers couldn't agree on whether it was poison or a stroke, but the effect was the same. The rebellion lost its head, and Basil kept his throne. And Basil, having watched Roman soldiers waver while foreign ones held the line, drew the obvious conclusion. He kept them. That corps of northern warriors hardened into a permanent institution, the Varangian Guard. For the next 2 centuries, the man standing at the emperor's shoulder was far more likely to be from Uppsala than from Rome. So what did the city actually see when the guard came through? A wall of very large men carrying a weapon that became their signature. The long-hafted, 2-handed axe, slung across one shoulder. In a court that worshipped subtlety and silk, they were deliberately, almost theatrically foreign, and that was the point. You were meant to notice them. They were paid in gold, quartered close to the emperor, and they earned a second reputation off-duty as prodigious drinkers, enough that at least one Byzantine writer reached for a nickname built around their thirst. You were meant to notice them then, too. Our best witness here is about as good as the period allows. She wasn't a monk copying rumors in a distant monastery. She was a Byzantine princess, the daughter of an emperor, writing a history of her own father's reign from inside the palace itself. She calls the Varangians axe-bearing barbarians, and then she says something that gets to the very heart of the design. Their loyalty to the emperor, she writes, was a kind of inheritance, a pledge handed down from father to son, kept inviolate, so deep in them that they wouldn't listen to so much as a whisper of treason. Now, a princess had every reason to flatter the men guarding her family, so let's hold that word inviolate a little loosely. But she is describing something real, a reputation so solid that a hereditary emperor trusted these outsiders more than he trusted his own countrymen. When the daughter of the palace tells you the safest men in the building are the ones who could never belong to it, the machine is running exactly as designed, and the machine could make a man extraordinarily rich. To see what a career in the Guard actually looked like, follow one man, probably the most famous who ever served. In the 1030s, a Norwegian prince in exile arrived in Constantinople and took the emperor's coin. Over roughly 8 years, he fought wherever the empire needed blades. In Sicily against Arab forces, in Bulgaria against a revolt, back and forth across Asia Minor. He climbed the ranks, earned a court title, and did what the smart Varangians did. He shipped his growing fortune north to Kiev for safekeeping, well out of reach of Byzantine politics. Getting out, though, was harder than getting in. When Harald decided he'd had enough and wanted to go home, the story goes that the emperor didn't want to release so useful a sword and refused him leave. His exit came wrapped in one of the ugliest episodes of the age. In 1042, the capital erupted against the reigning emperor, a mob and palace factions tearing him down in days, and the Varangians were in the middle of the violence. The northern sagas go further and credit Harald himself with putting out the fallen emperor's eyes, the standard Byzantine way of ending a rival's career without quite killing him. We should hold that particular claim at arm's length, since it comes from the same saga tradition that liked its hero at the center of every storm. What's clear is that Harald left in the chaos, slipped out past the chain that guarded the harbor, and pointed his ships north. He went home a wealthy man, and used that Byzantine gold to buy his way onto the throne of Norway. His name was Harald, and history remembers him as Hardrada, the hard ruler. And here is where his story stops being an adventure. In 1066, Harald sailed for England to seize a third crown, and at Stamford Bridge, in the north of the country, his invasion ended with an arrow through the throat. 3 weeks later, and 200 miles to the south, the exhausted English king, who had just beaten him, lost his own throne to William of Normandy at Hastings. Sit for a second with the shape of that single life. The same man was a bodyguard to the Roman emperor, a Viking king, and one of the defining casualties of the most famous year in English history. The Guard was not a footnote to the Viking Age. For a while, it was where its biggest figures went to get rich. And 1066 didn't only end Harald. It quietly rewrote who the Guard was. Because the other great loser of that year wasn't a man. It was an entire ruling class. When William's Normans took England, the Anglo-Saxon nobility didn't merely lose a battle. They lost their country. Their lands were parceled out to French-speaking newcomers, their titles erased, their futures cancelled in a single conquest. Dispossessed fighting men with nothing left at home needed somewhere to go. They went to Constantinople. In the decades after Hastings, so many English exiles took service in the Varangian Guard that the character of the unit shifted beneath them. The Northmen kept coming, but now a growing share of the emperor's Viking bodyguard were English refugees carrying a very particular grudge. At the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 1081, Anglo-Varangians chasing down fleeing Normans got cut off from the main army and were cut to pieces, still fighting the same enemy that had taken their homes, now an entire continent away from them. Here is the detail I find almost too neat to be true, except that it is true. By the 12th century, this elite unit, founded by Scandinavians, still called Varangian, still famous across the empire as the Emperor's Vikings, was in large part English-speaking. The personal bodyguard of the Roman emperor had become, in effect, a colony of men who had lost England. They guarded somebody else's empire because their own country no longer existed for them to return to. The machine that ran on men with nothing to inherit had just been handed a whole generation who'd been stripped of everything they owned. Now I owe you the honest note, because the loyalty story is a little too clean, and the truth underneath it is more interesting than the myth. That inviolate loyalty had exceptions. In 1077, the Varangians took part in the fall of an emperor. A Byzantine historian records them turning against Nikephoros III. So the line about men who'd never listened to a word of treason isn't quite the whole picture. But look closely at what it took. The Guard turned only when an emperor was already finished, already losing, when the source of their pay and their safety was collapsing, regardless of what they did. That doesn't break the theory. It proves it. Their loyalty was never a moral fact. It was a structural one, aimed at whoever actually held the power, and the instant the power drained away, so did the reason to defend it. There is a second story I have to flag rather than sell you. According to the sagas written down in the north, the Guard enjoyed a spectacular perk. When an emperor died, they were allowed to walk through the imperial palace and help themselves to its treasure. It's a wonderful image. It is also the kind of claim that reaches us mainly through Norse storytelling set to paper 2 centuries later, not through Byzantine record. So treat it as a saga's flourish, not a documented line on the payroll. The distinction matters, because the real evidence for these men, when it finally surfaces, isn't a legend at all. It's carved into a wall, which brings us to the end, and then back to that railing. By 1204, the empire was rotting from the inside, and an army of fellow Christians, the Fourth Crusade, raised to march on Jerusalem, turned on Constantinople instead. As the city was betrayed and broken open from within, the Varangians were among the last men still holding their stretch of wall, fighting crusaders in the streets of a capital that was already lost. The foreigners were still at their posts long after the locals had gone. It was the beginning of the end for the Guard, and for the city they had been bought to protect. There is nothing clever to say about the sack that followed. Constantinople never truly recovered from it. But go back, before all of that, to the quiet years, to the top of Hagia Sophia, the great church at the very center of the city. Up on the second-floor gallery, in the marble of the railing, there are scratches. In 1964, someone finally read them for what they are: runes. One of them spells out, as near as it can be made, a Norse name, Halfdan. Another was found in 1975. That is the cold open. That is the man with the knife. Not a hero from a saga. Not a flattering line in a chronicle written to please a dynasty. Just a guardsman, standing a long shift in a foreign church, thousands of miles from wherever he was born, bored enough to carve his own name into the emperor's house. Nobody embellished it. Nobody passed it down and quietly improved it in the retelling. He scratched it. The stone held it. And it is still there today, behind a small pane of glass, waiting for tourists who mostly walk straight past. So here is what the Varangians actually leave us, and it is colder than the Axes and the gold. For the whole long span of Roman history, the emperor was killed by his own guards far more often than by any foreign enemy. And the solution, when it finally came, was not to find better men. It was not to inspire deeper loyalty or to demand stronger oaths. It was to find men who had nothing to win, strip away every alternative, every faction and inheritance and road to the throne, and what's left standing behind a man can look an awful lot like devotion. But it's really just arithmetic. The most trustworthy person in the room, it turns out, isn't the one who loves you most. It's the one who has nowhere else to go. If you want the other side of this coin, the guards who did the killing, the Praetorians who sold an empire they didn't even own, that story is waiting for you right here. I'll see you in it.